Buenas tardes a todos y todas las que
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to all of you connecting and now watching us on the other side of the screen. Because today, with this session, we start this fifth cycle of Utopias in La Casa Encendida. And we have this first session that we believe is quite a luxury. And we have Derek Walker here with us. He is the Commissioner for the Future Generations in Wales. It's an institution that was created thanks to a law that was passed in 2016 on the well-being of future generations, which is a pioneer worldwide. And Derek will talk to us about what it is and what it does. And it has a lot to do with a way of updating our democracies and helping us get out of the short-term vision we are so rooted in. And complementary, we will have Margarida, who's a member of, well, she's actually the president or the coordinator, I can't remember her position, of the GOB, an environmental organization that has promoted the law for the welfare of future generations of the Balearic Islands that was passed thanks to a successful popular legislative initiative, and that is the first way of transposing into our regulation, NAC, that has been inspired by the one that Derek is going to be talking about. So the idea of today's session is to get to know in depth the project, the process that they have gone through in Wales, and then Margalida will complement and will enrich that first intervention. And after these two presentations, there will be a conversation between Margalida and Derek, a conversation, and then we will open up the debate to the audience. So you may ask questions or make comments through the chat box. It can be a very interesting session. You know that you can always choose the language you feel more comfortable in because there is simultaneous translation. So you can listen to these presentations in English or in Spanish. So if you think that you might not get everything that is being said in English, we have an interpreter in the background who will be translating into Spanish. So without any further ado, I just thank you for being there on the other side, and I will give the floor to Derek so that he may begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Lo siento, no hablo español, so I'm going to be speaking in English, but I'm very pleased to be joining you today, and I hope the information that I can share will be useful and interesting for you. Before I put my slides up, I should say I'm calling from Wales. So those of you that don't know Wales, Wales is a part of the United Kingdom, a small part of the United Kingdom, just 3 million people in the west of the country. It's the most beautiful part of the United Kingdom, but it's not the most wealthy part of the United Kingdom, and it's possibly the wettest part of the United Kingdom. But we're really pleased and proud and humble of our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act or legislation that, as you heard, came into place back in 2016. It's an important piece of legislation for us that is the framework for governance and policy making and programs in Wales and applies to our public sector. So I'll tell you more about that now. So my plan is to go through the presentation by telling you about why we did this, then about how it works, and then to tell you a bit about the impact it's making, because this stuff only matters if it's making a difference. It's not good enough, of course, just to have good quality legislation. We need to have good quality impact and outcomes as well as a result of the legislation. So I will talk a little bit about that legislation too. So let me bring up my presentation. Here we go. And if someone could just indicate that that is all working, that would be great. You're nodding. I can see some nodding. Thank you. So, oh, it's sliding through. It's not meant to be doing that. So I'm Derek Walker. I'm the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I'm the only person with this job in the world. So There are no other Future Generations commissioners that are statutory, i.e. set up by law, or that are independent of government. So lots of other countries are looking at similar approaches, lots of other regions and states looking at similar approaches, but no one is the same as the approach that we're taking in Wales, which is fine, because this is not a cookie cutter approach. This is not something that you can cut and take and move and bring to another part of the world. Other countries and regions will want to think about it for their context and adapt it for their circumstances. But I will tell you a bit about how we've done this in Wales, and as I say, take you through the story of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Just a little bit about me. Before doing this job, I was the chief executive of a cooperative development agency in the UK called Cwmpas, and we were the largest cooperative development agency in the UK. And so that approach to business, that approach to businesses that were more sustainable, thinking social, economic, and environmental and cultural dimensions of their businesses, was an important part of experience that I could bring to this role. So if I explain this diagram, so excuse me that it's in English, but this is about intergenerational fairness, of course, and there are many reasons why we've taken this approach in Wales, but ultimately it's being good ancestors, doing the right thing for generations who are yet to come. We know that if we don't act now, our planet won't be healthy or even livable, perhaps, for future generations. So we owe it to those future generations to act in the best interests of people today, but also of people tomorrow. So this is what it's all about. It's about this long-term thinking approach to public policy and thinking about acting today and for a better tomorrow. These quotes give you a bit of feedback about the kind of pushback that I get in this role about the job and why we shouldn't be doing this. So why are we thinking about future generations? We need to be focusing on current communities. And this is probably the biggest challenge that I get in a time of poverty, in a time of economic challenge. The public bodies, the public sector organizations, and the leaders within those organizations will often push back and say, well, we've got so many big issues to deal with now. How can we be thinking about the interests of future generations? They will also say, or people will say, our ancestors didn't think of us, so why should we do any different? If they, they didn't do the right thing by us, so we should carry on in that path. And, a similar point, we're dealing with a cost of living crisis. We can't spend money on the future when we've got things to do now. Well, all of these comments are legitimate challenges, of course, but ultimately, we know we can't go on. We can't keep making the mistakes that past generations made. And ultimately, we can't afford not to do this agenda, because we know if we push back some of the decisions and the actions that we need to be taking now, first of all, it will be too late to make a big difference or a sufficient difference to climate change, for example. But it will also mean things that we should be doing now will become more expensive to do in the future. And we have examples of this already, don't we, of course, whereby if we'd, in a UK example, if we'd done more to adapt to climate change, to reduce carbon emissions, to think about the impact of climate change, we wouldn't have such an expensive bill to adapt now. If we'd been acting and thinking about the long-term health of our population, then the cost to our health service wouldn't be so great. We wouldn't be having the levels of obesity and diabetes type 2 in our hospitals that will make our NHS, our health service, unsustainable if we don't get ahead of them. So I've talked a bit about why this agenda is so important, but let me say a few things more. This is, for us, a number of things. This is the latest stage in our approach to sustainable development in Wales. So what I should have said at the beginning is Wales, as a part of the UK, has a devolved settlement. So the government of Wales has responsibility for things like health, education, certain aspects of the economy and transport, and other areas of responsibility, agricultural policy, for example. We're able to act in those areas in Wales, in the Welsh public sector. What we want to do, though, is to move towards a positive future. So I think for many people, particularly young people, the future can perhaps seem very scary. The nature of climate change and the overwhelming impact that is likely to have can be quite scary for many people. We see climate anxiety amongst our young people in our schools. So this is about trying to move towards something that's positive, not burying our heads in the sand and thinking we can't do anything, and as a result we're just heading towards a negative, unhappy future. This is about taking control and shaping a positive future. It might not be the same as it is today. In fact, it won't be the same as it is today. We won't be able to do, and we won't be doing many of the things that we do now. We will have to change. This is a bigger agenda around change, but it doesn't need to be any less positive. And in fact, it can be more positive if we have clean rivers and clean air, and we're growing good quality local food for our population to eat, and therefore they are healthier as a result. That sounds to me like a much more positive future than the current circumstances for many people in our country. So it's about that agency of the future, taking control of the future that we want to bring about. But it's also about being resilient to crises. So thinking about what is ahead and preparing for what is ahead. As a country in the UK, we weren't as prepared as we should have been for the COVID pandemic. But if you take this long-term agenda, if you think long-term and think of future generations, then and anticipate potential crises, then you're more likely to be taking the action and prepared for when these crises come about. This is always also about, I think, a responsibility. So I'll come to the image on this slide, and I think it's pretty clear for what I'm saying here, but we have a responsibility to those that are yet to come. As I said at the outset, we have a responsibility to be good ancestors. And this shows a projection. If you look back 50,000 years, there were something like 100 billion people that have lived previously. If you look at the current population of the Earth, it's something like 7.78 billion people. But if you look at 50,000 years ahead, we're talking 6 to 7 trillion people that are likely to live on our planet. So we have a responsibility to those people to do the right thing. And this is not that far ahead. It's the people, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren that we're acting for, to make sure that they can have a happy, prosperous lives and a healthy life on this planet. So ultimately, we have a duty to all those yet to come. So this agenda is also looking at these long-term risks to our society. So these risks that I put on the slide here come from the World Economic Forum. So I guess it's the global risk register for us as a world. And it's about thinking about these long-term risks and making sure we're acting on them rather than just thinking about our day-to-day issues. We're acting on these long-term risks. And you can see out of that top 10, 6 of them are in the space of environmental action. 2 of them societal, 1 of them technological, and 1 of them geopolitical. So there is a mix of different types of risks. But through this approach that we're taking in Wales, what we're trying to do is to make sure that our public bodies, our public sector organisations, have a long-term view and are thinking about the long-term risks to our society. They're not just thinking about the next election. They're not just thinking about the time that they're in the job until they retire. They're obliged to think about the long-term risks for our country and for the globe when they're taking their decisions. And similarly, this is about thinking about the future trends that we're facing as a society. So I've talked about climate change. Technology can be things like AI, the impact it's going to have, the benefit it can have, but also the ethical dimension of that. How are we harnessing and thinking about AI so it can benefit us for the future? The language, sorry, on the right-hand side of that screen is in Welsh. It's just saying the same thing as the language on the left. Demographic shift. We're expecting big population shifts within the world as a result of climate change, flooding and so forth, heat waves and so forth. So that will have an impact, and we need to plan for that. So effectively, it's about future trends and future thinking. One of the typical trends or reactions that I get around thinking long-term, thinking future trends is, how can you look into the future? We're not psychics. We're not able to see what is around the corner, so there's no point worrying about it. Well, this is, in English, we would say this is not about predicting, this is about projecting. So this is not about just taking a leap of faith about what might be happening in the future, but this is about looking at the data. This is looking at the long-term trends, and that gives us a good idea about where things are heading if we don't act. So this is about using the information we have and looking at the trends and information that we have in order to take account of it and to either harness the opportunities effectively, or potentially, react or prepare for the negative side, or mitigate those downsides. I always think that if we are doing this agenda right in Wales, we will be, when we compare ourselves to other countries, we'll be thinking, well, we acted, so we're not facing the same crisis as the country next door, because we were preparing for the future. And similarly, if there was an opportunity and we were able to harness that opportunity because we could see it coming and we were looking that far ahead, we would be better able to harness that and leading the world in that respect. So it's very much about a long-term agenda, thinking 50, 75, 100 years ahead, rather than just the next election. So this is what we did. So this is that. Previously, it was the case for doing it, and perhaps I should say, before I finish talking about the case for doing it, I would say the people of Wales are largely supportive of this agenda. So even though sometimes I get pushback from politicians or political policy leaders or leaders of public bodies, most people that I speak to about it understand the practical side of this. They think it's common sense. They want us to be acting long term. They're fed up of short term solutions that need to be fixed in a few years' time. Things being built and then needing to be rebuilt very shortly afterwards, that is ultimately costing the taxpayer more. They're fed up of seeing short-term political actions being taken when they want us to be acting for the long term. And so I think there's large public support for this agenda, but it's nonetheless quite a challenging one to deliver on. So if I tell you then a little bit about how we've delivered on this in Wales, I'll get to the more practical side of things. So ultimately, this is about embedding the sustainable development principle into legislation. And it's about acting in a manner which seeks to ensure that the needs of the present generations are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So it's acting today for tomorrow. It's not one or the other. It's not sacrificing the interests of current generations in order to meet those of future generations. It's trying to do those things both at the same time. Now, obviously, that is challenging, but ultimately, it's trying to do both at the same time and using the framework of long-term thinking to take decisions that are right for now and right for the long term. The Sustainable Development Principle is effectively our Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act, which came in 2015, was agreed in 2015, and became live from 2016. So we've got 9 years of experience of delivering against this legislation. It only applies to our public sector, so it doesn't apply to private businesses, and it doesn't apply to the third sector or the not-for-profit sector. And that's partly because of devolution in Wales. So the settlement in Wales and the powers of the Wales government, the Welsh government, mean that they only were able to apply this to the public sector. But it's so good for me to see that the third sector, which is my background, the not-for-profit sector, my background, and the business sector, also my background, get this. They're supportive of this. They're voluntarily going along and applying the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to the work that they do. And I've been delighted to see the level of interest outside the Welsh public sector. So this is how we did it. So we're the only country in the world to have legislated for the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we've done is we've looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we've put them into law, and we've obliged our public sector organizations to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we don't have the same number of SDGs. We've got our 7 well-being goals, which is the diagram on the right. So you can see we've got a prosperous Wales, a globally responsible Wales, a Wales of a vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a Wales of cohesive communities, a more equal Wales, a healthier Wales, and a resilient Wales, which is where the environmental action comes in. So these are our long-term goals as a country. We have a sense of direction, which are explained by these well-being goals, as we call them. And they're not a pick and mix approach. All of our public bodies are required to deliver on this agenda collectively. They don't just pick one, they pick all of them. And that's a crucial way of working, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we have these long-term goals as a country and long-term direction. And I won't go into each of these goals separately, but they are interesting in themselves. So a prosperous Wales doesn't talk about GDP, doesn't talk about those traditional measures of growing the economy. It talks about a fairer economy, fair work. It talks about a low carbon economy. It has an interesting description about what we mean, a progressive description about what we mean by a prosperous economy and a prosperous Wales. And a more equal Wales is similarly, it's about what we want to see. We want to see not just equality, we want to see equity. We want to see better outcomes and fairer outcomes for all of our population, and thinking about how we do that. So that might mean different activities for different groups and more intensive support perhaps for those that need it, but getting to a destination that gets us to a place that's a much more equal country. And we know that's the right thing to do morally, but it's the right thing to do by our public services and the cost of our public services. And it's the right thing to do for the cohesiveness of our country and the success of our economy. So all of these goals are interrelated, and public bodies are obliged to look at all of them in achieving their obligations under the Wellbeing Act. Let me move just a little bit onto the left-hand side of the screen, and these are the 5 ways of working. So public bodies have to explain how they're delivering against our long-term goals, but they also have to demonstrate how they are delivering what we call our 5 ways of working. So this is really at the heart of this legislation, because the theory is that if you do the ways of working, then you will deliver usually against the well-being goals, and the ways of working are how myself and others look at public bodies and understand whether they're actually doing the right thing by this legislation. So prevention, obviously clear that this would be part of the way of working. It's thinking about not just acting on the problems of today, but preventing problems arising in future. Collaboration is about working together, partnership. Public bodies not just keeping to their own lane, but working across other public bodies to achieve their goals. Health is perhaps the best example of this, whereby we know in the UK only 13%, something like that, a small amount of our health outcomes are determined by the National Health Service, by our health service. The rest of it is because of having work, because of having good relationships, because of having clean air, access to food, and so forth. So the rest of our health is dependent on those wider determinants of health. And so that requires our health authorities, our health boards, as we call them, to collaborate with other parts of the public sector to deliver better health outcomes for our people. So collaboration is an important part of this. Similarly, integration is about merging these agendas. So collaboration is a partnership between public bodies. Integration is about thinking beyond one policy issue. So when you're thinking health, think environment, think economy at the same time. If you're thinking about, similarly, if you're an environmental organisation, you should also be thinking health, economy, culture, Welsh language as you're delivering on your agenda. So again, it's about avoiding that silo mentality, which we can be guilty of in the UK. The 4th way of working, and these are in no particular order, is about involvement. So involving people in the decisions that affect them, co-producing decisions with the people of Wales. This is not about passive consultation. This is not about taking a decision and then asking after the decision, what people think of it. It's truly working alongside the people that are going to be affected to get to the right decision. That might take more time sometimes, but it usually leads to better results. So we want to involve the people of Wales in the decisions that are being taken about them in a true collaborative partnership way. And then finally, the final way of working is around working for the long term. So not just short-term thinking, long-term thinking, which is shorthand for this whole agenda. Future generations, very much thinking long-term and acting long-term. Okay, so this brings me on to my powers as the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, my role and powers. We talk in I don't know how this translates, but we talk in English about carrots and sticks. Maybe there's a translation for that in Spanish. And my powers are primarily in the area of carrots, incentives, support. So I'm there to provide advice and to promote good practice. I'm there to carry out research, to guide public bodies about what they should be doing. I'm there to monitor their progress. So I assess whether they're delivering or they're meeting the 5 ways of working, and whether they're moving us towards the well-being goals. And if I'm not satisfied with that progress, I can review their work and make recommendations about what I would expect to see to make improvements. And those recommendations are usually listened to. They have to respond to what I say. They don't automatically have to do what I say. I'm not a minister. I'm not a minister of government. But they do have to respond. And my experience and the experience of my predecessor has that these reviews do have an impact and are listened to by the public bodies to which they're directed. If you look at the Future Generations report, which is the fourth document or image from left to right on the screen, this is a report I will produce every 5 years. And so the next report I will produce will be in 2025. And this is produced 1 year before our government elections, before the Welsh government elections in 2026. And the purpose is for me to provide a review on how well we're doing as a country in this agenda, but also make recommendations for what I would like the political parties to consider when they are delivering their programme of government. So when they are thinking about their manifestos, when they're preparing for the election, I write a report 1 year in advance to try to influence their manifestos, and hopefully a lot of that will then become embedded in their manifestos, and should they be successful in government, then become part of the programme for government. Again, this is about thinking ahead, I guess, so that we're not trying to influence governments once they've got elected and they've already got a programme of work, but trying to make sure that this is incorporated into what they voted on to do, and it's part of their agenda from day one. And then the final image is about sharing and encouraging good practice, and that very much is an important thing to do. We find that sharing good practice from around the world can be very helpful in influencing our public bodies, but also our public bodies are very keen to hear from what others are doing in order that they can learn and adapt and implement their own approaches. So that is an important part of the role that I have. So this is effectively what my powers are and my role. There is also a role for the Auditor General for Wales, and so you could paraphrase this. This is not exactly right, but my role is much more around the good cop, advising, encouraging, promoting, and the Auditor General, as auditors, as their role is often seen, is about calling things out perhaps as well when they're not seeing the 5 ways of working being delivered. So we share a role in independently assessing impact and advising on progress. What I haven't said then is the Wellbeing goals have 50 indicators. We have a basket of 50 indicators which are measures of success, which tell us whether we're doing a good job or not. So this is critical. If you don't measure what you're doing, then you don't know whether you're making a difference, and it tends not to have as much impact. So we have 50 national indicators that tell us whether we're making progress or not towards our wellbeing goals. They don't cover everything, but they're a good basket, I guess, a good range of measures which try to give us the best indication of whether we're meeting the wellbeing goals. And within those 50 indicators, there are 17 milestones which tell us, a staging point in terms of our progress. So you can see here, healthy life expectancy at birth, including the gap between the least and most deprived. So we want to increase the healthy life expectancy of adults and narrow the gap in healthy life expectancy between the least and the most deprived by at least 15% by 2050. So you can see I haven't said this before, but we're using the timeline usually of 2050 as the sort of long-term range that the legislation covers, although public bodies are encouraged to go further than that should they want to. Reducing the pay difference is another indicator on the basis of gender, disability, and ethnicity. And looking at our biological biodiversity within Wales. So frighteningly, 1 in 6 of our species, of our wildlife, is threatened with extinction in Wales. And we want to reverse that decline and then see the recovery of our biodiversity in Wales by 2050. So we have these indicators and milestones which tell us whether we're doing a good job or not. And each year, the Welsh Government will produce a report, a Wellbeing of Wales report, which will give us a state of the nation. How well are we doing against these 59 national indicators? Which ones are going well and which ones are not? And that is there to guide us to make change if we're not making the progress that we want to see. And finally, in this section about telling you how it works, so we've had this legislation since 2016. I'm telling you a simple version of this, so there's a lot more besides, but we have a legislation, 2016, it applies to the public bodies, public sector, local authorities, health bodies, Natural Resources Wales, the public sector organisations in Wales. They need to work towards our 7 wellbeing goals. They need to demonstrate 5 ways of working. They need to set objectives and report on progress. And we assess this through our national indicators and our milestones. And I am there to support and advise them to do this and to call out things if I'm not happy with progress. But one of the really crucial things, I think, for us has been the national conversation that we held prior to the legislation. So we held a national conversation speaking to thousands of people right across the country about what they wanted this legislation to do and how they wanted to work. And this conversation was called The Wales We Want. What is the Wales we want to see in future? And I think as a result of that national conversation, we've put down some really firm foundations for this legislation. It's people's legislation. It's something that the people asked our politicians to put in place and that they're supportive of and they believe in. So I think that has put down these firm foundations, as I say, into the ground. I think it would make it quite difficult for politicians to get rid of the legislation personally, because it's got that buy-in, that support from across the country. But I think perhaps even more important than that for us, what it is meaning is that people are going to their public bodies, they're going to their municipalities, and they're saying, I don't agree with the decision you've taken around this coal mine or this road or whatever it might be. And I don't think this is in line with our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And they're challenging decisions by the public sector where they think the legislation is not being applied. And that is the real work of change for me. That is when you see the difference being made. It's all very well for me to challenge things, but I've got a small team and I can't be across everything, can't be involved in everything. But where you see people taking this legislation into their own hands and speaking to their public bodies and making it real and say, you know, we're proud of this legislation. We want this legislation in Wales to work. We want to act on the act. We want to make a difference because of this legislation. That's when you see the significant change taking place across Wales. So this takes us on to, so what? What difference has this made? Is this worth doing, and why is it worth doing? So I've been in the job this year, 1 year only, and the second Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So my predecessor was in post for 7 years. I'll be in post for 7 years. I've just done 1 of those years. And the first 7 years were very successful in terms of raising awareness and putting the guidance in place, setting up the processes, and starting to see some big changes happening. So hats off to my predecessor who worked with the public sector to make that happen. But my assessment coming into the role is, you know, we've got to go further and faster. We have a climate and nature emergency, and we have growing health problems in our country. And so there is much more change that's required. We need to close the gap between the ambition that we have and the implementation that we have. Having said that, there has been some important changes, as I say, and this is one of those areas. So the act in action, probably the clearest example to give is in terms of the impact of the legislation on the transport policy. So way back in 2018, so 6 years ago now, there were proposals for a big new motorway, which would be a motorway relief road going around the south of one of our biggest towns, or one of our biggest cities. And it would have, it was proposed because of congestion on our motorway, and this would give more capacity to take cars along this busy motorway. And my predecessor challenged this proposal that had been agreed by government to build this big new motorway on the grounds that it wasn't in line with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. How could we be spending all this money on a new road, which was going to put future generations in debt? This was going to be billions of pounds, or 1.4 billion pounds, I think, and would cost future generations, they would have to pay that loan back. It was going to go over areas of nature and environmental importance, so there would be damage to our environment in terms of where it was going to be built. We know it was likely to produce more carbon emissions because, our experience, the more roads you build is often creates more carbon and more cars and more traffic. And so this decision was challenged, and as a result, the government changed its mind. The First Minister changed his mind, and we didn't go ahead with that road. And since then, we've seen our transport policy flipped on its head. So 2019, there was a decision to not build new roads unless they met certain criteria. There's not a ban on new road building, but they need to meet certain criteria in terms of how they support cycling and walking and public transport, how they can reduce carbon emissions, that sort of thing. We now spend, or this is in the last Senate, we're spending 2/3 of our transport budget on roads, and that switched to about 2/3 on public transport and active travel. So a complete reversal, I guess, or change in the prioritization of where the money of our transport budget was going, much more on walking and cycling and public transport, and on low emission vehicles. And as you can see from the hierarchy, private motor vehicles being at the bottom of that pyramid. And that also led to an increase in our budget on sustainable active travel, so walking and cycling lanes, a significant increase in that. So I've got this out of order. The new road building projects was 2022, when there was a decision not to build new roads unless they meet certain criteria. That wasn't. That was later on in this journey. But anyway, what this is seen as quite a switch around. We also introduced a 20 miles per hour zone speed limit in many parts of our towns and cities, to reduce speed, of course, and to reduce road deaths on our roads, but also to make it more attractive for people to cycle and to walk because cars are going at a lower speed. So we've seen a real shift in our transport policy in Wales. We've still got somewhere to go, and ministers will admit this. We've seen this big investment in public transport, but it's still nowhere near the quality that it needs to be. We'll still need to work hard to make sure people are spending more time, are switching modes from car transport into public transport. We need to see more of that happening, more people walking and cycling. The public transport needs to be in a good state to really encourage people out of their cars, and we've got some way to go on that. But this is the journey we're on to change our country as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And here are three more examples. I won't go into those in so much depth, but just to show you that this is not just an environmental or just a transport agenda. This covers all sorts of agendas, and you can point to lots of initiatives and reforms as a result of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. So on the left, we have a basic income pilot for care leavers. So people who are in the care system, young people who don't have parents and are looked after by the state. We were finding that once the state didn't support them at the age of 18, their outcomes were poor. You know, they were often finding it difficult to find accommodation to carry on with their education. They didn't have the support structures that many of us were to have. So our government has introduced a pilot program whereby they will have a basic income until for a certain amount of time to support them during that transition from the care system to adult life. And we think this will be the right thing for those young people in terms of their outcomes, but the right thing for the taxpayer as well in terms of the cost to society of, you know, the support that these young people might need should they not be achieving their potential. So that's still going on, this pilot. We've only seen some early findings from the pilot program at the moment, but it's the type of thinking, long-term thinking, but also broad thinking, integration, collaboration, looking across well-being goals that is coming about as a result of the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. In the middle, we've had a change to our curriculum. So a much broader based curriculum, giving young people the skills that they need for the long term, for the future, transferable skills. So less of a traditional approach to education where you just learn a subject, but you learn skills through different subjects. And we hope this will give the young people a broader range of transferable skills for the long term. We're also incorporating a bigger dimension around eco-literacy and environmental awareness amongst our young people so that they are better prepared for the future. And on the right-hand side, perhaps another example of how this is making an impact. We think in Wales we're the third best performer in the world in terms of our recycling rates. So the best in the UK and the United Kingdom, but the third best in the world in terms of the amount of waste that we recycle for other use. So we actually have a new legislation coming in at the moment, applying to small businesses, which will further improve our performance in this area. But it's evidence, I think, of a different agenda in Wales and a different approach that we want to take. So that concludes my presentation. It's just a quick canter through the approach that we've taken in Wales. I'm hoping that can be useful. It is world leading. We're the only country in the world to be doing this, and we're delighted that the former UN Assistant Secretary General gave us this quote: "What Wales is doing today, the world will be doing tomorrow." We want to be we're modest about this approach because we have a long way to go in terms of implementation and lots to learn from everyone around the world. But we think it's the right approach for us, and it's the right approach for our country in the way that we've delivered it, but also the right approach for young people, for people today, and for the generations to come, for the future generations of our country and the world. That we're doing the right thing for today and for tomorrow. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. Gracias for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Derek. Well, Margalida, if you wish, you can just share your comments, your experience, and we will then have a short debate. Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your invitation to participate in this first session of this Utopia cycle, because it's true that when Kois told us about it, we were very happy to be able to share our point of view with Derek Walker, because we have always had you as our inspiration while we were drafting our law. I mean, the Welsh proposal was our main inspiration. So all of these things came about in the Balearic Islands, the small corner of the Mediterranean Sea, just because we wanted to have a positive proposal that would allow us to overcome that short-term vision that we usually have in our policies. I'm talking about policies in general, but in our islands, more specifically, we are islands that are very specialized in tourism from an economic point of view. We specialize in tourism, and tourism has many impacts and consequences on our territory, on our resources, and it has determined a social organization that in this last few years has been showing some symptoms of dependence, an absolute dependence of this economic sector that causes lots of social vulnerability. The life conditions in the Balearic Islands are precarious. For instance, accessing housing is something that is not at all guaranteed for the people who live here. And facing all of these processes, we in social and environmental associations, we have decided to work together, but we couldn't really have a positive vision for the future, saying we don't want this, but we don't want to stop thinking about what our future should look like. And that long-term vision, we didn't really know how to make it tangible. We didn't know how to materialize it. We wanted it to be a narrative that could be something that would fill people with hope. We wanted it to be hopeful. We wanted to be inspired by someone else. And we were very lucky because we have people at the university who work on environmental conflicts, and they work on the law, on environmental law, people who work in the field of environmental policies, and they all were having Wales as a reference. And we actually had a colleague who was doing his PhD on this Welsh law and its implementation this last few years. So we were in a work group trying to think, what proposal can we actually present our society with? And that's when he talked to us about the Welsh case. And we said, well, let's go for it. This is it. This is the idea. This is what we want to transmit. So our proposal was to launch it through a popular legislative initiative. So it was using an instrument, a tool that we have, because it is something that we have at state level, but also at regional level. So we wanted to be able to create a law that would come from us, from a citizen proposal. So that requires a whole process. We needed to gather signatures, we needed to collect signatures, then make a proposal to the Parliament of the Balearic Islands, and the Parliament of the Balearic Islands would, through the political parties in the Parliament, consider whether they would hear about that possibility or not, and then they would start the procedure to accept the law. So as an environmental association, we had presented during our 50 years of existence in the islands, it's an old organization, as you can see, 5 different legislative initiatives. We had always collected the signatures and so on, but we never managed for the law to be approved in the end at the Parliament. This has been the first time that the Parliament at the Balearic Islands in its 40 years of existence, because during the whole democracy, that's 40 years, this institution had never accepted any of these initiative proposals. It was the first time that they would accept a popular legislative proposal. So we had to launch a text and a campaign that lasted 4 months, through which we collected over 12,000 signatures of people who were for the project. We had to explain to people what it was that we were proposing, what it was that our law consisted of, what was it, this law that would fight for the well-being of the current and future generations, because in the Balearic Islands, it talks about both the future and present generations. That's the name of the law. We needed 7,000 signatures, but we got over 12,000 signatures. So we really had the full support of the society. And in the end, the law was approved during the last plenary session of the parliament during the last mandate. And when Derek was telling us about the proposals, I was actually laughing inside because our objectives, our well-being objectives, the ones that are set in our law, are exactly inspired in your objectives in the Welsh law objectives, everything that has to do with prosperity, resilience, health, equity and equality, culture, the language. This responsibility also understood as understanding the repercussions of our actions in the rest of the planet, this global vision. So the objectives are the same, and with a language that we thought was understandable in our context. So also, obviously, in that sense, we were focusing on public policies. Obviously, we were focusing on the drafting of laws and sectorial planning. We think that those are the main tools, the main planning tools for long-term policies in the end. So we were mainly focusing on drafting of laws and strategic sectorial planning, whether it's energy, transport, and so on. So the main difference that we had to tackle in order to apply a similar law in our islands was that we could not offer the possibility of creating a commissioner. We did not have the legal framework for that to be proposed. So we considered laws that already existed in the islands and that had a structure that would allow somehow to provide us with an example of how we could do that evaluation of public policies along the way, knowing that we could not generate a new governmental structure. So we wanted also for it to be independent. We wanted the person to evaluate those public policies to be independent, so that they could really check what the impact for future generations might be. So what we did was create a commission, the Wellbeing Commission, the Commission for the Wellbeing of Future Generations. And this commission, obviously, is made up of, well, that's our proposal. It has to be made up of independent people from different fields, different areas. Derek was talking about the fact that you have powers in agriculture, health, transport, and so on, that allows you to have a holistic view. Well, we thought the same thing. We thought about that multi-layered perspective and not just think about the climate or the environment, which is obviously one of our priorities, but it's just one of the different pillars, one of the different legs that we wanted to consider. And that is why the members of this commission that we are proposing have to be independent experts in different fields such as education, agroecology, but also the environment and biodiversity and climate, but also social justice and economic models and urban planning, water resources, equality, migration, culture, youth, public health. So we had considered a commission that would have a very holistic perspective, considering many different aspects, and they would be the ones who would have to evaluate those public policies. But in that sense, we had to adapt the Welsh proposal, and that was because we had to adapt and compare ourselves to laws that already work here. When in the Balearics we have a law that is passed, they have to include a gender impact report or a climate impact report. So what we did was add one more vision, which would be that all the projects would have to have a report of the impact that it would have on future generations. So during the legislative process, the public administration would draft that report and the commission would evaluate that report. That is our idea of the way it should work. And then the commission would draft or would issue an opinion that could be favorable or could have certain conditions. And we didn't want for it to be, if the report is not favorable, the law cannot go ahead. But it would allow us to at least open a public debate about the relevance or not of that law. So our initial idea was, if the report is not favorable or the opinion is not favorable, there should be a public consultation process. But when our law proposal was being debated within the parliament and during the amendment process, that point was sacrificed. The political parties did not really like that idea of having a public consultation in case of an unfavorable opinion by the Commission. But we do think that we have an opportunity to open a public debate if we ever see that the Commission has issued an unfavorable opinion with regards to a specific law project. And then there are a series of actions as well for public policies, such as, for instance, the budgetary law or public purchasing law, when these are important amounts, or public investments, important public investments. Well, they will not go through this report in the approval phase, but they would be the object of a report at the end of the year that would be drafted at the end of the year by the Commission. So that way we would give that role of analysis to the Commission with some perspective as well. So obviously we don't have years of experience because the law was passed last April, and there was a political change in the interim. So we're now working with the current government in the islands to see how, without them deciding to sacrifice the law, and they have already said that they will not do it, which was one of the things that we were really worried about. They are not going to repeal the law, but they want to put it under a magnifying lens because they want to really look into it. So we have initiated a work process with this new government team, and we are trying to see if we all understand what the situation is. So we're answering their doubts, and we're just explaining to them how the law would be applied. When they don't really understand certain things, we try and explain it to them. And obviously they need this first phase of implementation, because we don't have that first implementation phase, because although the law has been passed, for instance, there was a 6-month term for the Commission to be created, but that term has not begun. So we haven't, those 6 months have not started counting, but we want to review that. We want to be able to offer options so that we can solve their doubts. And actually, Derek, maybe that could even be a question. For us, the main problem that we have with this new government, with this political representatives who have to put in place these, or who have to issue these reports, is that this will tangle the activity of public policies. This will be some more red tape. It will go against an agile process for the administration, because they have always wanted to have an agile administration. That's the neoliberal perspective, you know, everything needs to be agile. Money needs to move around quickly. So when we say that, they always say, no, this is going to be a hurdle along the way. It's going to make things much slower. The legislation process is going to be much slower. We don't think that's really the case. We think it forces us to have a new vision, a new perspective, but the Commission will have to indicate the guidelines, will have to issue the indicators so that we can issue our reports, because obviously before the reports we need to have all that basis. But they always say that that's an inconvenience, because it makes things too complicated, because now administrative proceedings are going to be much more complicated. So I will benefit from this opportunity I have been given to ask you this question, so that I might come back with enough arguments to show them that this is not going to slow things down. It's actually an investment in time. It's an investment that is going to sustain and to better structure policies in the long term. So with your presentation, you have actually given me many arguments so that I can sell once again in a positive light this need for a long-term approach in spaces that are not used to do it. So I really thank you for your presentation, and I really I'm grateful that we can now have a conversation with you and with the people who might ask questions via the chat. And we will keep on working so that this can be applied really in the islands.
It's wonderful what you're doing in the Balearic Islands, and I really wish you well. It sounds like you're making great progress, and in solidarity to what you're doing, if we can be of any help to what you're doing, we'd love to be supportive of that. We get challenged in the same way, that this is added bureaucracy sometimes, but I think that misses the point about why we're doing this. I feel, as a former chief executive of an organization, where you have a strong vision for the organization and a sense of direction, that means sometimes quicker decisions. People are enabled to take decisions because they know where we're heading. And I think that same applies to the country. If we know where we're heading as a country, if we know how we're measuring our success, that aligns not just the public sector, but the third sector and the private sectors to go in that direction. And I think that can help us move more quickly and more effectively than it would do otherwise. I think that, there can be dangers in this. Sometimes those that misunderstand this process can hide behind process and hide behind paperwork. And I think if we were to review our legislation, we might reduce some of the process that we've put in place, because ultimately this is about outcomes and making a difference. But I think the other main thing I would say, my experience is this doesn't need to take more time. It's just a different way of taking decisions. It's a different framework for governance and decision making that considers the long term as well as the short term. It's not two separate things. It's doing it in the round. So it's not an extra process. It's just a different way of taking decisions, a different frame, a different length of time, and a longer term agenda. So it needn't be. I genuinely, can tell you this. I'm not just saying this to give you arguments to take back. It doesn't need to take any more time. It's a different way of doing things.
No sé, Derek, si quieres hacerle alguna pregunta a Margalida, sí que...
I don't know, Derek, if you want to ask any questions to Margalida, or if Margalida has other questions. I did have some prepared, but now we see that there are some questions on the chat as well. So I don't know how you want to go about it. Well, if you want to maybe give the floor to the audience, because that also will be nurturing for me, because I will see other viewpoints as well. Okay, then I will ask you the first question, because I was thinking about the commissioner and the commissioner's office and the two laws from the two different territories, thinking about the well-being of future generations as an improvement of democracy, because now that we see an explosion of far right, there are some temptations. No, people now have this urgency to just forego these procedures, these democratic procedures, and now people want to react quickly. And some people are now trying to democratize democracy as well. So I connect that with the experience that we had in Spain with the Citizen Assembly for Climate. That was a very successful experience. 100 people who were chosen randomly, and the result of their work was then given to the government as a representation or a sample of the citizenship in Spain. That was the majority, people who were not necessarily aware of everything, but it was 170 recommendations, very brave, audacious, that could actually be a political program in and of itself. If someone were to decide to take that on and just defend it until the end. So this is a question for Margalida and Derek. These assemblies and the well-being of the future generations. I mean, this figure of the commissioner as an independent figure. Could we think of translating this to other levels? Because these citizen assemblies are being translated to other other levels such as regional, municipal. What other innovations do you think we could include as well in the democracy as well, so that democracy is more participatory, so that it's more alive as well, so that it's not reduced just to elections and electing a political party and participating only every 4 years, because in the end that is what we end up doing. That is what democracy is in the end reduced to.
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have the right answers. But the approach I think that we are trying to which is incorporated in our legislation, is this idea about involvement. So very much working hard to involve citizens in the decision-making processes and the delivery potentially around how we take this forward. And we have had some examples of citizens' assemblies as well. And I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies as one way in which you can engage more people in the decisions that need to be taken. But there are other ways, I think, as well. As I mentioned in my presentation, I'm a big fan of co-production and kind of digital agile approaches to service design that really involve citizens in taking decisions or being involved in how services are developed and what is prioritized and effectively what matters to them. And so I think this is a fundamental part of this agenda, that citizens are involved in it right from the outset, is the way we've heard in the Balearic Islands through the petition, the way we've done in Wales through our national conversation. It's not just an involvement of people at the outset, it has to be an involvement of people right throughout the process of delivering this agenda. And it also is an agenda around communicating, involving people in big change processes. So we in Wales, and I think around the world, others have had the same. We've had some kickback, some pushback about some of the big changes. So our agriculture, I think we've seen this right across Europe, but changes to agricultural policy in the UK, asking our farmers to plant trees and to save some of the land for peatland restoration, has had a huge amount of pushback and has been sometimes misunderstood about what the intention is, perhaps by marginal elements within these campaign groups, deliberately misunderstood. So we have to be better at bringing people along these journeys with us, don't we? So that they are involved and on board with these changes, because there are more big changes to come, and we're only going to be effective if we can take our population with us. So we have to really work hard to support the population and work to listen to people, to act on their concerns, to respond to their concerns, and take people on that journey. So it's tricky stuff to do. And our government has had some experiences where this has not gone well. And my concern is, when you don't do this well, it makes it more difficult for future politicians to take the brave decisions that we need. Part of my job is to give those politicians who are willing to take the brave long-term decisions, and not always will face a lot of flack and a lot of criticism. And we want our politicians to be brave and take those long-term decisions. And so part of my job is to give them some support for that, when I can see it being aligned to the right thing to do for the long term. So no easy answers, just that we need to look at citizens' assemblies and all different ways of involving our populations effectively in this agenda, so that this is a journey with people, not to people.
Sí, bueno, la verdad es que aquí también se ha...
Well, to be honest, we have had citizen assemblies here in the Balearic Islands as well. we had the statewide and then we had a regional one. Actually, last Saturday, we had a presentation of a documentary that showed the whole process of the Citizen Assembly, because it had been 1 year since the assembly here in the Balearic with its political proposals that are now trying to establish. Actually, those who were in the Citizen Assembly who were randomly picked are now being organized as an association. So they're giving a legal shape to this, trying to give support to the proposals that came out of the Citizen Assembly and to try and move them around the political arena, so that the people responsible for the institutions now understand that they have to defend part of the policies that were proposed there. I think that we in the Balearic Islands, both the ones that were giving support to the Citizen Assembly as well as those of us who were in the Popular Legislative Initiative, we saw that the bridges that were linking those two ways of doing things, those different tools, from the point of view of the democratic framework, because we all try to somehow go beyond the limits that had been imposed on us previously. But it's true that now, in this case, at least in our case, in the case of the Balearic Islands, the context has not made it easy for us. We have been somehow left out, and now we have a government that is for very neoliberal policies, and they're trying to avoid any hurdle along their ways, or they're launching a proposal, a decree proposal for the agilization of all administrative procedures that attack two of the main things that we want to establish with these new democracy instruments. The first one is the citizen participation, because they're trying to shorten the terms and shorten the periods for decision-making processes, and also environmental guarantees, which is one of the main pillars of this sustainability, this future sustainability. So we're currently in a context that is quite complex in that sense, and we find it very difficult to be able to think about whether we will be able to create a narrative that can also be defended by these neoliberal governments and by institutions that are led by political parties that have as their priority investment and capital's movement. And it's a big challenge. It's a very, very big challenge. So we can't really think about new ways of doing things in democratic spaces. I mean, we just want for this to be validated. These initiatives need to be validated because many people have worked on them. They have to see that this is a way of going forth. I mean, and the policies that have been put in place up till now have led us the wrong way, but it's not going to be easy. With private initiative, we see that we have a confrontation that we would like to avoid, but we can't. So the democratization processes in the end are pressure lobbies, and I think that's a mistake, because there is a pressure by promoters, investors, constructors, industry, economy, and then a pressure by the citizenship that has organized itself trying for political decisions to be made from a different place. And this confrontation does not guarantee a better democratic process. And I think that is one of the things that we have to know how to react to. We have to really show the value of this popular legislative initiative. And it's true that this context is very, very complicated, because very often these fights between different lobbies, when we read them like that from the society, they create loss of hope and a lack of integration, really. And I think that the narrative needs to change. That is why these exercises of new narratives is also very important in the framework of eco-utopias that create hope. That is an instrument, a very powerful instrument, and it is fundamental for these new challenges that we have in the Balearic Islands. Okay, then I will share some of the questions, because we have different questions, but they are actually worried about the same things. in both questions. For Margalida, it is actually to talk about the commission, the role of the experts, and the level of independence that this commission would have in the parliament. And then the one with regards to the level of involvement. We understand that both experiences, that of the commission as well as the commissioner role, in the case of Derek, don't have binding decisions, but I would like to know how you deal with the contradictions and when you have the possibility of making a series of recommendations, but they're not binding. I mean, it's not mandatory to listen to what you have to say. So that's one of the questions. And then there was another question that was about the level of contradiction. It was actually what Margalida was saying, economic growth on the one hand, and then the sustainable development goals, especially the ones that consider the fact that we need to slow down. So how would you nuance that all? Because I think that you both are shying away from the word growth in both laws, economic growth. So maybe you could talk about that. Well, with regards to the commission, we were looking at how we could consider it, how we could give it some independence. And we were thinking that maybe it would have to be linked to some space, some institutional space, even if it could not intervene in the decisions made by the commission. And that is what the law says. But in the end, we saw that linking the parliament was not feasible from the operational level. At least here in the Balearic Islands, the parliament does not have commissions that are under it. I mean, they only have two commissions. One has to do with the autonomy statute. So it has a lot to do with the autonomic reality, with a very, very slow functioning, not at all agile. And then another commission that has to do with anti-corruption that will be closed very soon. So we didn't want to be under the parliament umbrella, and we decided to link it to the regional ministry of the presidency. So it is under the umbrella of the regional government presidency in an organic way. So it's the president that has to find a physical space for the commission so that they can carry out their activity. But the election of the members is done by the parliament. The parliament will appoint the members of the commission. And in that sense, so the process that should have taken place would have been from the parliament, we would have to ask each of the political groups to propose names of independent experts to be a part of this commission. So it is a very large commission. It's over 12 people, I think, because they're experts in different fields. And I think it's going to be impossible for the different political groups to agree on 12 different experts from so many fields to create the commission. And that is one of the points where we're currently set, and that is something that we're currently fighting against with the government because they don't see it. Then we also have the Syndic de Greuges, which is something that we have here in the Balearic, which is the ombudsman here in the Balearic Islands, who should exist in the parliament in the Balearic Islands. So we should have an ombudsman who could maybe have the role of the commissioner, like Derek does in Wales. So we would simply include new competencies, and it would be a possibility to avoid such a large commission that is causing problems for the parliament. So that is the point we're at. And that is where we're stuck, and that is where we're analyzing possibilities.
Just to answer the question from Wales, we haven't had the experience so far where public bodies haven't accepted the recommendations that I've made. Sometimes, or my predecessor, sometimes they've maybe been slow to implement them, but largely where we've done a report and a review and made recommendations they've been acted on, which I think shows, the buy-in and the support for the legislation and the approach. It also, I think, shows how well calibrated, how well composed some of the recommendations are, recognizing what might be possible and what might not be possible. But the job is an independent job, so public bodies will not always be happy with the recommendations and the comments I make, and it's important that I am independent and am able to say things that they are not happy with. But I'm not a politician. I'm a public appointee. And so ultimately, the final decision rests with them. And democracy, I'm there to support them to take good decisions, right decisions, to criticize them, if I'm not happy with that. But ultimately, it is their decision. And I'm cognizant of the fact that that is ultimately the ultimate decision making. So if they did ultimately disagree and want to take a decision that was different, that would be up to them. It wouldn't stop me continuing to make the case and explaining why I thought my approach was the right one, but they don't have to comply with that because ultimately they're the final decision makers.
Bueno, pues hemos cumplido el tiempo que teníamos acordado, que era...
Well, we've run out of time. It was 1.5 hours. We know that these sessions are sometimes a bit of an amuse-bouche. It's not satisfying, but it is what invites you to keep on eating, doesn't it? So we should maybe keep on digging deeper and learning about this topic and the work that is being done both in Wales and in the Balearic Islands. Both very inspiring experiences because of everything that they have managed to institutionalize and because of all of the citizen movements that have been put in place. And I wanted to thank both Derek and Margalida for their participation here today, and to all the people who have stuck with us until the end. So thank you as well for being there, for bearing witness, and for being our accomplices at on the other side of the screen. So we will continue on the 14th with Crystal Bush, and we will keep on talking about these utopias and thinking about the importance of utopian experiments along the history, especially those that have a perspective that has to do with gender, with sharing resources in community, and so on. So thank you so much, and we will see you on Thursday.